The silence in the penthouse was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It clung to the marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed a glittering, indifferent Manhattan. Laura Kane, 7 months pregnant, stood before the open closet, her husband's suits hanging like soldiers in perfect, lifeless rows. Her hands didn't shake as she packed a small duffel bag, a spare toothbrush, a worn paperback, 2 changes of maternity clothes. It wasn't an act of panic, but of chilling clarity. The woman who had everything, the adoring millionaire husband, the designer life, the baby on the way, was erasing herself. She left the diamond ring, the credit cards, the keys to the kingdom on the cold granite countertop. Her only goodbye was the whisper of the closing door, a sound swallowed by the vast, empty opulence she was leaving behind forever. The air in the Upper East Side penthouse was always the same. Perfectly climate-controlled, faintly scented, with the white gardenia diffusers Patrick insisted on. It was an expensive, sterile smell that Laura had once associated with success. Now, it smelled like a tomb. For weeks, a creeping unease had been coiling in her gut, a feeling that had nothing to do with the flutters of the baby growing inside her. It was a cold dread that felt foreign in their sun-drenched, minimalist apartment overlooking Central Park. Patrick Clement was a master of grand gestures. He'd wooed her with helicopter rides over the city, surprise trips to Paris, and a 7-carat diamond that felt more like a beautifully crafted manacle than a symbol of love. He was charming, powerful, a titan in the world of private equity, and he had chosen her, Laura Kane, a quiet art curator from a middle-class family in Ohio. She had believed it was a fairy tale. She had believed his declarations of love, whispered against her skin in their sprawling, king-sized bed, were real. The first crack in the facade had been small, a dismissiveness in his tone when she talked about her day, a habit of checking his phone while she spoke, his thumb scrolling endlessly while she detailed a doctor's appointment or her hopes for their daughter. He called her anxieties hormonal, a convenient dismissal that made her feel small and irrational. He was busy, he'd say, closing a deal worth hundreds of millions. Her world revolving around their home and their coming child must have seemed trivial in comparison. "You worry too much, darling," he'd murmur, kissing her forehead, a gesture that felt more like a parent placating a child than a husband comforting his wife. Everything is perfect, but it wasn't. The perfection was a performance. She saw it in the way he arranged his life with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate takeover. His friendships were strategic alliances. His time was a commodity, allocated in neat blocks on his digital calendar. She, and now the baby, were part of the portfolio, the perfect family asset that complemented the billionaire philanthropist image. The night before she vanished, the unease had crystallized into a shard of ice in her heart. He had been getting ready for the annual Children's Literacy Foundation Gala, an event he chaired. He stood before the mirror in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, a vision of effortless power. "You're sure you don't want to come, Laura?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. There was no real invitation in his voice, only the performance of one. "The doctor said I should stay off my feet," she replied, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. It was a lie. Her doctor had said she was perfectly healthy. The truth was, she couldn't bear another night of standing by his side like a beautiful, silent accessory, smiling until her cheeks ached while he held court. He adjusted his bow tie. "A shame. It's important we show a united front. Tosha Walker will be there. Her firm is a major new donor." He said the name casually, but a flicker in his eyes, a minuscule, almost imperceptible tightening, told her everything. Tosha Walker. The name had surfaced in whispers and veiled comments from the other wives in their social circle. A brilliant, raven-haired corporate lawyer, 10 years younger than Patrick, known for her ambition and a wardrobe that could rival a runway model's. Patrick had mentioned her in passing, a brilliant legal mind he was mentoring. Laura had tried to ignore the insinuations, telling herself it was just gossip, the petty jealousy of a world built on competition. "I'm sure you'll represent us both perfectly," Laura said, her voice even, a placid mask hiding the tremor inside. He smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Always." He leaned down to kiss her, but his lips were cool, distracted. He smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. As he walked out the door, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a small, private smile touching his lips before he slipped it into his pocket. Laura waited for an hour, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. Then, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain, she did something she had never done before. She went to his home office, a sleek space of glass and steel. His laptop was open on the desk. She knew his password. It was the name of his first shell corporation, something he'd once told her with a self-satisfied laugh. Her fingers trembled as she typed. His emails were a fortress of corporate jargon and encrypted files. But his calendar was open. There it was, under the gala entry. 9 p.m. TW, post-event briefing. The Carlisle Hotel. Not his office, not a public place. It was the intimacy of the lie that broke her. It wasn't just the potential infidelity, it was the cold, calculated deception. It was the realization that while she sat at home, nurturing his child, he was scheduling his life in secret blocks she was never meant to see. A sudden, fierce protectiveness surged through her, not for herself, but for the innocent life within her. This child would not be raised in a house of lies, a gilded cage built on a foundation of deceit. She would not be another asset in Patrick Clement's portfolio. She walked back into the living room, the city lights twinkling below like a million indifferent stars. The decision was made. She wasn't running away in a fit of pique. She was escaping. She was a curator, after all. She knew the difference between a masterpiece and a very convincing fake. Her marriage, her life, it was all a fake, and it was time to take it off the wall. She began to pack 3 nights earlier. The ballroom at the New York Public Library was a symphony of excess. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears, casting a golden glow on the city's elite. Women in couture gowns floated through the crowd, their laughter like the chiming of delicate bells. Laura felt a familiar wave of dissociation wash over her. In her flowing emerald green gown, chosen to flatter her 7-month bump, she was just another part of the decor. Patrick was in his element. He moved through the room with the easy confidence of a king in his court, shaking hands, clapping backs, his voice a smooth baritone that commanded attention. Laura stayed by his side, a dutiful smile pinned to her face. She listened to conversations about mergers, offshore accounts, and the outrageous price of summer rentals in the Hamptons. She felt like a ghost, present but unseen. "Patrick, darling." A voice, sharp and melodious, cut through the din. Laura turned to see Tosha Walker. In person, she was even more striking than the photos in business journals suggested. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, fiery contrast to Laura's maternal green. Her black hair was styled in a sleek, severe bob, and her dark eyes held an unnerving intelligence. "Tosha," Patrick said, his smile widening, becoming genuine for the first time all night. "You made it. I wouldn't miss it. The cause is commendable," she said, her gaze flicking dismissively over the room before landing on Laura. Her eyes raked over Laura's pregnant form, a flicker of something unreadable. Pity? Contempt in their depths. And you must be Laura. Patrick has told me so little about you. The insult was as sharp and clean as a paper cut. So little about you. It implied Laura was an afterthought, a footnote in her own husband's life. Laura forced a smile. He's a busy man. He is, Tosha agreed, her attention already shifting back to Patrick. Patrick, I need to steal you for a moment. We need to discuss the Peterson proposal before word gets out. Patrick didn't hesitate. He placed a brief, proprietary hand on Laura's lower back. Be right back, darling. Stay put. He turned and walked away with Tosha, their heads bent close together, their bodies almost touching. They looked like a power couple, a matched set. Laura was left standing alone, a pregnant statue in the middle of a swirling party. She found a seat at an empty table near the back, the orchestra's soaring strings doing little to soothe the frantic beating of her heart. She watched them for nearly an hour. They weren't talking business. They were laughing, their heads thrown back. Tosha touched his arm, her red-nailed fingers lingering on the sleeve of his tuxedo. Patrick didn't pull away. He leaned in, his body language screaming intimacy and a shared secret. Later, the music shifted to something slower, more modern, the dance floor filled with couples swaying gently. Laura's feet ached. She felt a deep, primal exhaustion, the kind that pregnancy brought, and longed to be home. She scanned the crowd for Patrick, ready to signal that she wanted to leave, and then she saw them. They were in the center of the dance floor, but it was as if a spotlight had singled them out, isolating them in a world of their own. Patrick's hand was splayed possessively on the small of Tosha's back, his other hand holding hers tightly. Her arm was looped around his neck, her face tilted up to his. They weren't just dancing. They were communicating in a language of touch and glances that Laura had never shared with him. He murmured something in her ear, and she laughed, a throaty, intimate sound that tore through Laura like a physical blow. They moved together with a fluid, practiced grace. This was not the first time they had danced like this. This was not a friendly gesture for a business associate. This was a man dancing with his lover. Laura felt the air leave her lungs. The room began to tilt, the cacophony of voices and music fading into a dull roar in her ears. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, the silent, pitying stares of a society that had known Patrick's secret long before she had. She was the clueless, pregnant wife, a cliché, a joke. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and began to make her way toward them. She didn't know what she would do or say, but she had to break the spell, to shatter the perfect, cruel image they presented. As she got closer, she saw Patrick's expression. It was a look of unguarded adoration, a look he hadn't given her in years. "Patrick," she said, her voice a raw, broken thing. He turned, and for a split second, his face was a mask of pure annoyance. The adoration vanished, replaced by the cold irritation of a man interrupted. He looked at her swollen belly, and then back at Tosha. And in that single glance, Laura saw her own worthlessness in his eyes. She was an obstacle, an inconvenience. "Laura, not now," he said, his voice low and sharp. He made a small, dismissive gesture with his free hand, a flick of the wrist as if shooing away a fly. "Go sit down. I'll be with you in a minute." He didn't let go of Tosha. He didn't step away. He simply turned back to her, dismissing his pregnant wife like she was nothing. Nothing. Tosha's lips curved into a slow, triumphant smile. She met Laura's gaze over Patrick's shoulder, her eyes gleaming with victory. The world stopped. In that moment, Laura Kane died, The hopeful girl from Ohio, the loving wife, the expectant mother who believed in fairy tales. She evaporated, leaving behind a woman forged in the ice of public humiliation. She turned without a word, her back straight, and walked out of the ballroom, out of the library, and into the cold New York night. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The image of them dancing, of her husband's cold eyes, and his mistress's victorious smile, was burned onto the back of her eyelids forever. It would be the fuel that carried her away from him, and the armor that would protect the new life she now had to build alone. The first call came at 9:07 a.m. Patrick Clement was in a board meeting, expertly dissecting a rival company's quarterly report, when his phone vibrated against the polished mahogany table. It was the housekeeper, her voice a frantic mix of Spanish and broken English. "Mr. Clement, she is not here. Mrs. Laura, she is gone." Patrick felt a surge of irritation, not alarm. Laura was probably at a spa, or having an extended brunch with one of her vapid friends. "Calm down, Maria. She's an adult. She probably just went out." "No, Mr. Clement. Her ring, the big diamond one, it is on the counter, and her cards, and the keys for the car. Everything is here. Just, she's gone. The ring." That got his attention. The ring was an 8-figure asset. Leaving it behind wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. He ended the meeting abruptly, citing a family emergency, a phrase he delivered with practiced gravity. Back in his sterile office overlooking the financial district, he called his head of security and his personal lawyer, Jaime Hayes. Jaime arrived within 20 minutes, a man whose perpetual look of weary cynicism was a perfect match for his profession. He was sharp, efficient, and utterly discreet, the 3 qualities Patrick valued most in an employee. "She's gone," Patrick said, pacing in front of the windows. Took a duffel bag, left her ring, phone, and cards. Jaime raised an eyebrow. "A duffel bag says she plans on being uncomfortable for a while. Leaving the electronics and money says she doesn't want to be found. Did you have a fight?" "No," Patrick snapped, a little too quickly. "Everything was fine. Perfect. She was a little emotional last night. Hormones, you know. Upset she couldn't come to the gala." The lie slid off his tongue with practiced ease. He had been perfecting the narrative since he'd woken up in an empty bed. Jaime's expression didn't change. He'd worked for Patrick long enough to know that perfect was a public relations term, not a statement of fact. And there's no other reason she might have left? Nothing happened at the gala? Patrick's eyes narrowed. The gala was a resounding success. We raised over $3 million. He was deflecting, turning a personal question into a professional accomplishment. "I'll make some calls," Jaime said, pulling out his phone. "Hospitals, police. We need to file a missing persons report to get the ball rolling. We also need to control the narrative. A pregnant wife of a man like you doesn't just disappear. The press will be on this in hours. For the next few hours, Patrick Clement gave the performance of his life. He was the distraught husband. His voice was thick with manufactured concern as he spoke to the police, providing them with Laura's photo and a description of what she might be wearing. He called her parents in Ohio, his tone a carefully modulated blend of panic and reassurance. "I don't know what happened, Eleanor," he said to Laura's mother, his voice cracking on cue. "We were so happy. We were just picking out names for the baby last night. I'm so worried." But between the calls, in the silence of his office with only Jaime as his audience, the mask slipped. "Find her, Jaime," he commanded, his voice stripped of the false emotion, leaving only cold steel. "And find her quietly. I have the Kinsley merger negotiations starting next week. I cannot have this domestic drama derailing a $10 billion deal." Jaime watched him, his face impassive. "Your wife is 7 months pregnant and has vanished, Patrick. The deal might have to wait. Don't be naive, Patrick scoffed. Nothing waits. This is a complication, an inconvenience. She's probably shacked up at some hotel, trying to make a point. Find her, remind her of the terms of our prenuptial agreement, and bring her home. The prenuptial agreement. It was Jaime's masterpiece of legal brutality. In the event of a separation initiated by Laura without documented cause of infidelity, something that was notoriously difficult to prove, she would walk away with next to nothing. The penthouse, the cars, the assets were all his. She'd get a lump sum that, to a man like Patrick, was pocket change. It was designed to keep her in the gilded cage. He couldn't fathom why she would choose to leave it. The first hint of real trouble came late that afternoon. Jaime's private investigator, a former Mossad agent with a knack for finding people who didn't want to be found, hit a dead end. She's a ghost, the PI reported over the speakerphone. Paid cash for a bus ticket at Port Authority. One way to Albany. But she didn't get off in Albany. We have security footage of her getting off at a small, unscheduled stop an hour south of the city, place called Havenwood. Walked out of the station and vanished. No cameras in that part of town. No credit card pings. No phone activity. She's gone analog. Patrick slammed his fist on the desk. How is that possible? She's a pregnant woman, not a spy. She's smarter than you gave her credit for, Jaime said quietly, his eyes fixed on his boss. For the first time, Jaime saw a flicker of genuine fear in Patrick's eyes. But it wasn't fear for Laura's safety. It was the fear of a man who had lost control. His asset had liquidated itself. The phone buzzed again. It was Patrick's PR manager. Page 6 has a source, someone from the gala. They're running a story about you and Tosha Walker. The headline is, Clement dances with legal eagle while pregnant wife is home alone. Patrick's face went white. The narrative was slipping from his grasp. His performance was failing. Kill it, he snarled into the phone. I don't care what it costs. Call in every favor. Kill the story. But it was too late. The first crack in his perfect public facade had appeared. As Jaime watched his boss rage, a quiet, unsettling thought began to form in his mind. He was being paid to find a missing person. But what if, for the first time in his career, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted his client to succeed? He was hired to fix Patrick's problems. But looking at the cold fury on the billionaire's face, Jaime started to wonder if the real problem wasn't the woman who had vanished, but the man who had driven her away. The town of Havenwood, New York, was the antithesis of Manhattan. There were no skyscrapers, only two-story brick buildings with faded awnings. The dominant sounds weren't the scream of sirens, but the distant rumble of a freight train and the chatter of birds in the oak trees that lined Main Street. For Laura, it was the sound of anonymity. It was the sound of breathing again. She had gotten off the bus on a whim, drawn by the simple, unassuming name of the town. She'd walked from the bus stop for nearly a mile until she saw a small, hand-painted sign, Room for Rent. It was an apartment above a dusty antique shop owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 70s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Just you? Mrs. Gable had asked, her eyes falling to Laura's belly. Just me, Laura confirmed, her voice steady. She paid the first month's rent in cash, using a significant portion of the few $1,000s she had squirreled away over the years, her escape fund, a secret she hadn't even consciously acknowledged until the moment she'd needed it. The room was small, with a sloped ceiling, a single bed, a mismatched armchair, and a tiny kitchenette. Its one window overlooked a quiet, tree-lined alley. That first night, a gentle rain began to fall, and the sound of the drops drumming on the tin roof was the most beautiful symphony Laura had ever heard. It was the sound of being safe, of being hidden. The first week was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Every time a car backfired, her heart leapt into her throat, certain it was Patrick's driver. She'd wake from nightmares of the gala, of Tosha's smug smile, and Patrick's cold dismissal. She would place a hand on her belly, feeling the reassuring kick of her baby, and whisper, "It's okay. We're okay. We're safe now." Laura knew she couldn't hide forever without an income. The escape fund wouldn't last. She needed to become someone else, someone who belonged in Havenwood. She put away the designer maternity clothes she'd packed and bought simple dresses from the local thrift store. She started calling herself Grace, her middle name, a name that felt simpler, stronger. She found a job waiting tables at the Havenwood Diner, a classic chrome and vinyl establishment run by a gruff but fair man named Sal. The work was grueling. Her feet swelled, her back ached, and she had to endure the pitying or curious looks of the regulars who wondered about the pregnant girl with no husband and a story she wouldn't tell. "Where you from, hun?" Sal asked one afternoon as she polished silverware. "Out of town," she said vaguely, a line that had become her standard reply. Sal grunted. "We're all from somewhere else, I guess. Just try not to drop any plates. They cost me money." It was his version of acceptance. Slowly, tentatively, Laura began to build a life. It was a small life, a fragile one, but it was hers. Her days were measured not by social obligations and charity events, but by the rhythm of the diner, the morning coffee rush, the lunch special, the quiet afternoons. She learned the regulars' orders by heart. Mr. Henderson, the retired history teacher, who always wanted his coffee black and his toast burnt. The group of high school kids who came in for milkshakes after school. She found solace in the town library, a quiet, sunlit building that smelled of old paper and wood polish. She would spend her afternoons off reading, losing herself in stories of other lives, other worlds. She read books on childbirth and parenting, her excitement for her baby unmarred for the first time by the shadow of Patrick's expectations. This baby wouldn't be a clement heir, burdened with a legacy. This baby would just be hers, free, but the fear was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her new life. She avoided cameras and never used her real name. She paid for everything in cash. Sometimes, late at night, lying in her small bed, the magnitude of what she had done would crash down on her. She had walked away from a world of infinite resources. What if the baby got sick? What if she couldn't afford a hospital? One evening, a customer left a copy of the New York Post on a table. Laura's hands shook as she picked it up. There, on page 6, was a small article with a grainy photo of Patrick. The headline read, "Billionaire Patrick Clement's pregnant wife still missing. Friends fear the worst." The article painted a picture of a devastated husband, tirelessly searching for his beloved, unstable wife. It quoted an anonymous source who worried about Laura's fragile emotional state due to her pregnancy. Rage, pure and hot, burned through her. He was painting her as crazy, unhinged. It was a classic tactic, the oldest one in the book. Discredit the woman. He wasn't looking for his wife. He was managing a public relations crisis. He was protecting his reputation, his deals, his perfect image. She crumpled the newspaper, her knuckles white. The fear that had been her constant companion began to morph into something else. Resolve. She wasn't the fragile, emotional woman in the article. She was the woman who had walked out of a ballroom with her head held high. She was the woman who had crossed a state line with nothing but a duffel bag and a fierce will to protect her child. She was the woman learning to stand on her own two swollen feet. Patrick could have his empire of lies. She was building a life based on something far more valuable, the truth, and she would defend it, and her child, with everything she had. In his 50th floor office, Patrick Clement was losing his carefully constructed control. The Kinsley merger, the crowning achievement of his career, was faltering. Whispers about his domestic situation were spooking the more conservative members of the Kinsley board. The image of the stable, family man billionaire was crucial, and that image was now riddled with cracks. "They're postponing the final vote," he seethed, throwing a file across his desk. The papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. "Postponing? Because my wife decided to have a hormonal episode." Jaime Hayes stood by the window, watching the city below, his expression unreadable. In the month since Laura's disappearance, he had watched his boss devolve from a calculating predator into a cornered animal. The search had yielded nothing. Laura, or Grace, as the investigators now suspected she was calling herself, had successfully dissolved into the fabric of rural America. The other part of Patrick's world was also crumbling. Tosha Walker. The affair, once a thrilling, clandestine source of power and excitement, had become a liability. Tosha was no longer content to be a secret. She saw Laura's absence as an opening, a vacancy she was entitled to fill. She had started showing up at his office unannounced, her presence a blatant challenge to the carefully crafted story of the grieving husband. She called him incessantly, her voice alternating between seductive purrs and demanding hisses. "When are you going to announce us, Patrick?" she'd asked him the day before, her red nails tapping an impatient rhythm on his desk. "The story is out there. People know about me. It's time to stop this ridiculous charade of the worried husband." "It's not a charade, it's a strategy," he'd countered, his voice low and dangerous. "My pregnant wife is missing. I have to look like I care. Anything else makes me look like a monster. And monsters don't close $10 billion deals. So I'm just part of your strategy? A problem to be managed?" Her voice was laced with venom. "You're exactly what you've always been, Tosha," he said coldly. "A very talented lawyer and a very enjoyable diversion. Don't mistake your role." The slap had been so sharp, so unexpected, it had momentarily stunned him. He'd grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin, his face inches from hers. "Don't you ever do that again." The fire in her eyes was replaced by fear. She had finally seen the man behind the charm, the cold, ruthless core that Jaime had seen for years. She had hitched her wagon to a star, believing she could steer it. Now she was realizing it was a black hole, and it was pulling her in. It was this escalating chaos that had prompted Jaime to do something he never had before. Dig into Patrick's personal finances, specifically the accounts related to the prenuptial agreement. He told himself it was due diligence, a way to anticipate Laura's potential moves if she ever resurfaced with a lawyer. But deep down, he knew it was something more. It was a flicker of conscience. What he found was staggering. Patrick hadn't just protected his existing assets in the prenup. He had actively hidden dozens of offshore accounts and shell corporations created after the marriage. It was a systematic, deliberate campaign to defraud Laura of her share of the marital estate. Under New York law, it was grossly illegal. The ironclad prenup had a fatal flaw. It was predicated on a fraudulent disclosure of assets. If Laura ever found out, she wouldn't just be entitled to a small settlement. She'd be entitled to half of everything he'd hidden. It was leverage of the highest order. Jaime sat in his own office, the damning financial record spread before him. He thought of the woman he'd met only a few times, Laura Kane. Quiet, elegant, with a kindness in her eyes that seemed entirely out of place in Patrick's world. He remembered seeing her at that gala, standing alone, her hand on her belly, watching her husband dance with another woman. He had felt a pang of pity for her then. Now, it was something more akin to respect. She had done the one thing no one else dared to do. She had walked away from Patrick Clement. His phone buzzed. It was the private investigator. "I think I've got her," the man's voice crackled. "It's a long shot, but it fits. Town called Havenwood. A diner waitress. Goes by Grace. Pregnant. Matches the description. Paid for a doctor's visit in cash yesterday. The nurse is a cousin of a friend. Said the woman was worried about her third trimester checkup." Jaime's blood ran cold. "Did you tell him?" "Not yet. I'm calling you first, like you said." Jaime had given the PI that instruction weeks ago. A small act of rebellion he couldn't quite explain. He wanted to be the gatekeeper of this information. "Hold the location," Jaime said, his mind racing. "Do not send it to Clement. Tell him you're chasing a dead end in Pennsylvania. Buy me 24 hours. "It'll cost you," the PI said. "I'll double your fee," Jaime replied without hesitation, and hung up. He stared at the file in front of him, the key to dismantling Patrick's empire. He now knew where Laura was. He held 2 weapons in his hands, either of which could change everything. For years he had been Patrick Clement's fixer, cleaning up his messes, burying his secrets, enabling his cruelty. He had told himself it was just a job, that his morality wasn't on the line. But he was wrong. He looked at the evidence of Patrick's lies and Laura's quiet courage, and he knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue to be the loyal soldier, or he could do the one thing Patrick would never expect. He could choose a side. He picked up his phone and booked a flight. Then he called Patrick. "Good news," Jaime said, his voice a perfect imitation of his usual professional tone. "The PI has a strong lead, a woman matching Laura's description in a motel outside Philadelphia. He's heading there now. I think you should go. Your presence will show you're a hands-on, concerned husband. It'll play well with the Kinsley board." "Philadelphia?" Patrick said, a new energy in his voice. "Good. Excellent. Book my jet. I'm on my way." As soon as Patrick was in the air, heading south on a wild goose chase, Jaime Hayes packed the file on the hidden assets into his briefcase and started driving north, towards a small town called Havenwood. The bell above the Havenwood diner's door chimed, announcing a new customer. Laura, now nearly 9 months pregnant, didn't look up from the coffee pot she was refilling. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her body heavy with the final weeks of waiting. The diner was quiet, caught in the late afternoon lull between lunch and dinner. "Can I help you?" she asked, turning around, and her world stopped. It was him. Patrick. He stood just inside the door, looking utterly alien in his bespoke suit against the backdrop of faded vinyl booths and checkered floors. He was thinner, his face etched with a tension she'd never seen before, but his eyes held the same chilling intensity, the same look of ownership. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. The coffee pot slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor, the dark liquid and ceramic shards exploding across the linoleum. The sound broke the spell. "Laura," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He took a step towards her. "Stay away from me," she whispered, her hand flying protectively to her belly. Sal emerged from the kitchen, a spatula in his hand, his face a thundercloud. "Is there a problem here, Grace?" he asked, positioning himself between Laura and the stranger. "This is a private matter," Patrick said, his gaze fixed on Laura, dismissing Sal as if he were a piece of furniture. "Laura, we're going home. This ridiculous game is over." "My name is Grace," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "And I am home." The regulars, Mr. Henderson and 2 farmers at the counter, had stopped talking. The diner was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. "Don't be absurd," Patrick scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "You're coming with me. Now, I have a car waiting outside." He was talking to her as if she were a misbehaving child, not a woman he had betrayed. The rage that had been simmering for months finally boiled over. All the fear, the loneliness, the humiliation, it coalesced into a diamond-hard fury. "No," she said, her voice clear and loud. "I am not going anywhere with you. You have no right to be here. You have no power here." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "No power? Laura, I am power. Look at this place. Look at you. You're playing dress-up in poverty. Our child is not going to be born in some backwoods clinic because you had a sentimental fit. You are my wife." "I was your wife," she corrected him, stepping out from behind the counter, her belly creating a defiant space between them. "The night you danced with your mistress like I was nothing, that woman died. You freed me, Patrick. You just didn't realize it." His face darkened. "I will not have you speak of Tosha. This is about you, about your instability." The diner door chimed again. Both of them turned. It was Jaime Hayes. He looked tired, his suit rumpled from a long drive. He held a leather briefcase in his hand. Patrick's eyes widened in disbelief and then narrowed in fury. "Jaime, what the hell are you doing here? I thought you were in Philadelphia." "The lead was a bust," Jaime said calmly, his eyes not on Patrick but on Laura. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a strength he hadn't expected. "I had a hunch." "A hunch?" Patrick spat. "You work for me. You were supposed to report to me." "My job is to advise my client on their best legal options," Jaime said, his voice level. "And right now, your best option is to leave." He turned his full attention to Laura. "Mrs. Clement, Laura, my name is Jaime Hayes. I was your husband's attorney." He took a step forward and placed the briefcase on the counter. "I believe this belongs to you." Laura stared at the briefcase, then at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What is this, Jaime?" Patrick demanded, moving towards him. Jaime stood his ground. "It's a divorce settlement proposal, a very generous one. I took the liberty of drawing it up on your behalf." He opened the briefcase and turned it so Laura could see the contents. It was filled with files, spreadsheets, and bank statements. "This," Jaime said, tapping a thick file, "is a full accounting of 27 offshore accounts and 12 shell corporations established during your marriage, with assets totaling over $900 million. Assets that were not disclosed in your prenuptial agreement, making it null and void due to fraudulent inducement." The color drained from Patrick's face. He looked at Jaime with pure, murderous hatred. He had been betrayed by the one man he thought was unflinchingly loyal. Jaime looked back at Laura. "He can't touch you, Laura. He can't force you to go anywhere. If you want it, this information gives you the power to claim half of his hidden empire, enough to ensure you and your child are safe and independent for the rest of your lives. Or you can use it as leverage to make him disappear from your life forever. The choice," he said, his voice softening, "is entirely yours." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Patrick stared, speechless, at the evidence of his ruin laid bare on a diner counter. Laura looked from the files to Patrick's ashen face, and then to Jaime, the unlikely, quiet savior. She took a deep breath, her hand never leaving her belly. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable calm. She was no longer a victim in this story. She was the one holding all the power. "Get out," she said to Patrick, her voice not a plea, but a verdict. "Get out of my town." Patrick Clement did not crumble, rage, or beg. That would have been too human. Instead, a chilling stillness settled over him. His face became an inscrutable mask of polished control. He looked at the files, at Jaime's impassive face, and finally, at Laura, who stood unbored before him. He saw not the woman he had married, but a formidable opponent. He straightened his tie, a small, automatic gesture of a man reasserting his composure. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for her. "You will still be the woman who abandoned her husband. You will drag my name, the name of our child, through the mud. My child won't have your name," Laura stated, her voice unwavering. "And the only person who dragged your name through the mud was you. You did it on a dance floor in front of everyone. This," she nodded towards the briefcase, "is just the receipt." He held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for a crack, a flicker of the timid woman he once knew. He found none. With a final, contemptuous look at Jaime, he turned and walked out of the diner. The bell chimed softly, marking his exit. The engine of a black luxury sedan roared to life and then faded into the distance. The storm had passed. The silence he left behind was heavy. Sal cleared his throat. "Grace." "Laura." "You okay?" She turned to him, a real, unforced smile gracing her lips for the first time in months. "I am, Sal. Thank you." She then looked at the two farmers and Mr. Henderson, who were all trying very hard to pretend they hadn't been listening to every word. She felt a surge of affection for these people, for this town that had unknowingly become her sanctuary. Her attention finally settled on Jaime. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why would you do this? You worked for him." Jaime slid the briefcase towards her. "Let's just say, my billable hours were starting to weigh on my conscience. I've spent years helping men like him win. I wanted to see what it felt like to balance the scales." He paused, his gaze professional, but not unkind. "You should get a good lawyer. Not me. Someone who specializes in family law. I can give you a few names. They won't be intimidated by him." "Thank you, Jaime," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "You didn't have to." "Yes," he said with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire career. "I think I did." He gave her a small, respectful nod and walked out of the diner, leaving her with the keys to her future. 6 months later, the snow fell in thick, silent flakes outside the window of Laura's new home, a small, 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of Havenwood, purchased not with Patrick's money, but with the advance from a trust set up by her lawyers. The divorce had been brutal but swift. Faced with the evidence of his staggering fraud, Patrick had no choice but to settle. Laura hadn't taken him for half. She hadn't wanted a war or his blood money. She had wanted freedom. Her lawyers had negotiated a settlement that was more than fair, establishing an ironclad trust for her and the baby, and more importantly, a legal agreement that terminated all of Patrick's parental rights in exchange for her silence about his financial crimes. He had chosen his empire over his child. Laura had never been more certain she'd made the right choice. In a bassinet by the crackling fireplace, her daughter, Haley Grace Kane, slept soundly. She was a beautiful, healthy 3-month-old with Laura's calm eyes. She was the center of Laura's universe, a universe that was now small, quiet, and profoundly rich. Laura had bought the Havenwood diner from Sal, who was happy to retire and spend his winters in Florida. She kept the staff, promoted a young, ambitious cook to manager, and worked there 3 days a week, not because she needed the money, but because she loved the sense of community. She was no longer Grace the pregnant waitress, but Laura, the owner, a friend. She occasionally saw news of her old life. Patrick's Kinsley merger had ultimately failed. The whispers about his disastrous marriage had been the final straw for the board. Tosha Walker had quietly left her law firm and vanished from the society pages, a cautionary tale of a woman who flew too close to a collapsing sun. Jaime Hayes had quit his high-powered firm and was now doing pro bono work for a legal aid society. Laura felt no triumph in their downfall, only a distant, quiet pity. They were all still trapped in that gilded cage, fighting for power and position. She was free. She picked up Haley, whose tiny fists clenched and unclenched in her sleep. She smelled of milk and innocence. Laura held her close, looking out at the snow-covered trees. Her wealth was not in a bank account. It was in the solid weight of her daughter in her arms, the warmth of the fire, the silence of the falling snow, and the hard-won peace in her own heart. She had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. She had lost a fortune, but had found something infinitely more valuable: herself. Laura's story isn't just about a vanished wife. It's a powerful testament to the strength it takes to walk away from a life that shines on the outside but is hollow within. She traded a penthouse for a small room, a millionaire for a community, and a life of luxurious dependency for one of meaningful independence. Her journey reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in carats or stock portfolios, but in self-worth, courage, and the freedom to build a life on your own terms, for yourself and for the ones you love. She didn't just escape a bad marriage. She reclaimed her own soul. What would you have done in Laura's shoes? Is the courage to leave more powerful than the comfort of staying? We all face our own versions of a gilded cage. If this story of betrayal, resilience, and redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they have the strength to start over. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one.
Imagine this. You're 7 months pregnant, alone in a Paris hospital, and your millionaire husband walks out on you during labor on purpose. He's not just leaving, he's setting a trap. But what he doesn't know is that you're about to rise from the ashes, take over an empire, and make him regret the day he underestimated you. This is the true story of betrayal, revenge, and a $212 million secret. And it all started in one hospital room. Stay with me until the end, because the final twist will leave you speechless. If you love stories of jaw-dropping comebacks, hit that like button, drop a comment, share this with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because you're about to hear how the phoenix rose. The monitors beeped steadily in the sterile room of Saint-Antoine Hospital, their rhythm suddenly interrupted by Margaret Sullivan's sharp gasp. She gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white against the metal. Outside, Paris glittered in the evening darkness, but inside this room, her world was collapsing. "Richard, the baby is coming early," Margaret said, her voice strained with pain and fear. At 43, she had thought this pregnancy was her miracle, their chance to save a 20-year marriage that had been slowly unraveling. Her husband stood by the window, checking his phone. Richard Sullivan, 52, with his perfectly styled silver hair and $1,000 suit, didn't even look up. "I have a board meeting in New York tomorrow morning," he said, his tone as cold as the December air outside. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're leaving me here in Paris." The contraction peaked, and she had to breathe through it before continuing. "Richard, I'm only 7 months along. This is dangerous." "You'll be fine," Richard said, already gathering his briefcase. "The doctors here are competent enough." A nurse entered, her soft French accent filling the room. "Madam Sullivan, we must prepare for delivery. The baby, she is coming whether we are ready or not." Richard was already at the door. "I'll have Mark Stevens contact you about the paperwork." "What paperwork?" Margaret called after him. But another contraction stole her breath. "Just some financial matters." Richard said without turning around. Nothing you need to worry about right now? The nurse, whose name tag read Sophie, moved to Margaret's side, checking monitors with practiced efficiency. Your husband, he is leaving, she asked gently. Margaret nodded, unable to speak as tears mixed with sweat on her face. She thought about the prenup she had signed 20 years ago, young and in love, never imagining she would need to remember its contents. She thought about how Richard had insisted she come to Paris alone for her art exhibition, claiming he had too much work to accompany her. The exhibition that now seemed like a carefully orchestrated trap. Madam, you must focus, Sophie said kindly. Your daughter needs you to be strong. Daughter. Margaret held on to that word as Richard's footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor, each step taking him further away from his family. She had spent 2 decades supporting his career, hosting his dinner parties, charming his clients, putting her own art career on hold to be the perfect corporate wife. She had endured 3 miscarriages, countless fertility treatments, and the cruel whispers at country club events about her empty womb. I'm alone, Margaret whispered. Sophie squeezed her hand. Non, madame, you are not alone. We are here. As the contraction peaked, Margaret realized she had never been more alone or more determined. Her millionaire ex-husband might have abandoned her, but she would not abandon herself. She had $10,000 in her personal emergency fund, a talent for painting that had once shown promise, and now, a daughter who would need her to be stronger than she had ever been. The doctor entered, speaking rapid French to Sophie before switching to accented English. Mrs. Sullivan, the baby is in distress. We must perform an emergency cesarean. Margaret nodded, her mind surprisingly clear despite the pain. Do whatever you need to do. Save my daughter. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, Margaret caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, frightened, abandoned. But somewhere beneath the fear, she saw something else. A spark of anger, a seed of determination. Richard had left her with nothing but medical bills in a foreign country. He had walked out during her most vulnerable moment, probably heading straight to whatever younger woman had caught his attention this time. After 20 years of marriage, he couldn't even pretend to care long enough to see his daughter born. The anesthesia mask covered her face, and as the world began to fade, Margaret made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would protect her daughter, and somehow, some way, she would make Richard Sullivan regret the day he walked out of this hospital room. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Sophie's gentle voice. Courage, madame. Tomorrow is a new day. If only Margaret had known how prophetic those words would prove to be. 6 hours later, as dawn broke over Paris, painting the hospital room in soft pink light, Margaret woke to find Sophie adjusting her IV. The young nurse smiled when she saw Margaret's eyes flutter open. Madam Sullivan, your daughter is stable in the incubator, Sophie said softly. She is small but fierce, like her mother. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. Can I see her? Of course, but first, Sophie hesitated, wringing her hands. There is also a gentleman asking for you. He says he is your husband's attorney. Margaret's stomach dropped. Through the fog of pain medication, she tried to make sense of this. Attorney is Richard back. Is he handling the medical insurance? Sophie helped Margaret into a wheelchair, her movements gentle but her expression troubled. I do not think so, madam. This man, he seems uncomfortable. They wheeled past the nursery first, where Margaret saw her daughter for the first time. Tiny, perfect, with a surprising amount of dark hair. The baby lay in the incubator, fighting for every breath. Margaret pressed her hand against the glass, tears streaming down her face. What will you name her? Sophie asked. Emma, Margaret whispered. After my grandmother. She was the strongest woman I ever knew. A beautiful name for a beautiful fighter, Sophie said. Now, shall we meet this attorney? Mark Stevens stood in the hallway like a man facing execution. His expensive suit couldn't hide his discomfort as he clutched his briefcase with white knuckles. He was younger than Margaret expected, probably early 30s, with nervous eyes behind designer glasses. Mrs. Sullivan, he began in measured tones, not quite meeting her eyes. I've been instructed to inform you that Mr. Sullivan has initiated divorce proceedings. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She gripped the wheelchair arms, her IV line pulling tight. He couldn't even wait until I delivered, Stevens shifted uncomfortably. The papers were filed yesterday evening, New York time, approximately 3 hours after he left the hospital. 3 hours, Margaret repeated numbly. It took him 3 hours to decide 20 years meant nothing. There's more, Stevens continued, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He's claiming abandonment since you chose to stay in Paris for your art exhibition. He states that you refused to return home when requested, and that this constitutes willful desertion of the marriage. Margaret's shock transformed into something sharper. She thought about the exhibition Richard's idea, Richard's insistence she go alone. He had even chosen the gallery, made all the arrangements, insisted it would be good for her to have some independence. He planned this, she said, her voice growing stronger. The exhibition, sending me here alone, all of it. Stevens didn't deny it. Instead, he placed a folder on her lap. The initial settlement offer, Mr. Sullivan is proposing you receive the Connecticut house and $50,000 annually in alimony. Margaret opened the folder, her artist's eye immediately catching the discrepancies. The Connecticut house has a mortgage, and $50,000 a year. Richard makes that in 2 days. Mr. Sullivan's position is that you have your own career as an artist, Stevens said weakly. A career he made me abandon, Margaret shot back. I haven't sold a painting in 5 years because he needed me at every corporate event, every dinner party, every... She stopped, breathing hard. The incision from her C-section throbbed with each word. Sophie stepped forward protectively. Perhaps Monsieur Stevens could return later when Madame is stronger. But Margaret raised her hand. No, I want to hear it all. What about Emma? What about our daughter? Stevens looked even more uncomfortable. Mr. Sullivan is prepared to pay child support as required by law. The minimum amount based on the calculation. The minimum, Margaret interrupted. Of course, and custody. He's not seeking any custodial rights. He's prepared to sign away parental claims in exchange for reduced financial obligations. The room spun. Margaret closed her eyes, hearing Richard's voice from years ago. Children would just interfere with my career trajectory. She had been so young, so eager to please, agreeing that they would wait. Now, after years of fertility treatments he had grudgingly funded, after the miracle of Emma's conception, he was walking away from his own child like she was a bad investment. Mrs. Sullivan, Stevens prompted, do you have any questions? Margaret opened her eyes, and something in her expression made Stevens take a step back. Just one. Did Richard mention that he changed all our joint account passwords while I was in labor? Stevens paled. That would be illegal. Marital assets are frozen until the divorce is final. Yes, Margaret finished. So how exactly am I supposed to pay for this hospital, for Emma's care, for a plane ticket home? I wasn't aware, Stevens began. Of course you weren't, Margaret said quietly. Richard never tells anyone the whole truth. He just moves the pieces around his board and expects everyone else to figure out the game. Sophie cleared her throat. Monsieur Stevens, I think you should leave now. As Stevens gathered his briefcase, Margaret called after him. Tell Richard something for me. The attorney paused at the door. Tell him thank you, Margaret said. Stevens looked confused. Thank you for finally showing me exactly who he is, Margaret replied, and for teaching me that narcissistic abuse doesn't always come with raised voices and violence. Sometimes it comes with calculated cruelty and designer suits. After Stevens left, Sophie wheeled Margaret back to her room in silence. The young nurse helped her back into bed, adjusting pillows with practiced care. Madame Sullivan, Sophie said gently, the hospital billing department will need to speak with you. Margaret laughed bitterly. I have $10,000 to my name. Emma's NICU care alone will cost more than that per day. One, there are payment plans, assistance programs. For a 43-year-old American woman with a $10,000 emergency fund, Margaret shook her head. I need to call my sister. Maybe she can... Madam, Sophie interrupted. There is a woman who has been waiting to see you. She says she overheard your conversation with the attorney. She would like to help. Margaret frowned. I don't know anyone in Paris except the gallery owner. She is not from Paris. She is, Sophie searched for words. She is formidable. That afternoon, as Parisian rain drummed against the windows, Margaret heard confident footsteps approaching her room. The woman who entered commanded attention without trying, silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a simple but expensive black dress, moving with the assurance of someone who had never met a room she couldn't own. Margaret Sullivan. The woman's voice carried a slight Boston accent, cultured but with steel underneath. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I own this hospital. Margaret struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pull of her incision. I don't understand. Eleanor pulled a chair close to the bed, her movements efficient. I was in the hallway this morning, not intentionally eavesdropping, but that attorney of your husband's has a voice that carries. I heard everything he said. I'm sorry for the disturbance. Don't apologize. Eleanor cut her off. I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same betrayal, the same financial manipulation, the same narcissistic ex-husband who thought he could destroy me and walk away laughing. Margaret studied the older woman's face. Eleanor appeared to be in her early 60s, with the kind of bone structure that suggested old money and good genes. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and won. You said you own this hospital, Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded. This one and 11 others across Europe. It's taken me 15 years to build this medical empire after my own divorce nearly destroyed me. She leaned forward. I know Richard Sullivan by reputation. Hostile takeovers are his specialty. He's very good at what he does, Margaret admitted. Eleanor laughed, a rich sound that filled the room. So am I, and I have a proposition for you. Margaret felt like she was in a dream, perhaps still foggy from the pain medication. A proposition, Mrs. Whitmore. I appreciate your concern, but I have nothing to offer anyone right now. I'm a 43-year-old woman with a newborn in the NICU and $10,000 to my name. Eleanor, please. And you're wrong about having nothing to offer. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city. This hospital is part of a medical chain I'm selling. I've had several offers, including one from a consortium that your husband represents. Margaret's heart sank. Of course he does. Eleanor turned back to her. But I'd rather sell it to someone who understands what it means to be vulnerable. Someone who knows what it's like to be dismissed and abandoned in their moment of greatest need. I don't understand, Margaret said. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an empire. Eleanor replied simply. But first I need to tell you something about your grandmother, Patricia Hartley. Margaret's breath caught. Grandmother, Patricia. She died when I was 5. I barely remember her. Eleanor smiled. She was my mentor, the first woman to serve on the board of Massachusetts General Hospital. She taught me that women supporting women wasn't just a nice idea, it was a revolution waiting to happen. I remember my father saying she was difficult, Margaret said slowly, that she had too many opinions. She had exactly the right number of opinions, Eleanor corrected, including one about your father. She knew he would waste any inheritance, spend it on bad investments and younger women. So she did something clever. Eleanor pulled a leather folder from her bag and placed it on Margaret's lap. She left you something in trust, something that could only be accessed when you truly needed it. The conditions were very specific: abandonment by spouse, life-threatening medical situation, or complete financial devastation. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the folder. The number at the bottom of the page didn't make sense. She counted the zeros twice. $200 million, she whispered. 212 million, with interest, Eleanor corrected. It's been waiting 38 years for this moment. This can't be real. Margaret looked up at Eleanor, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't anyone tell me? Your grandmother's instructions were very clear. You were to know nothing until the conditions were met. She didn't want you marrying for money or living your life waiting for an inheritance. She wanted you to become who you were meant to be first. Margaret thought about the woman she had been just yesterday, Richard's wife, hostess of his parties, the abandoned artist who painted in secret in the garage when he was traveling. That woman felt like a stranger now. Why are you helping me? Margaret asked. Eleanor sat back down, her expression softening. Because 15 years ago, When my husband left me for his 22-year-old secretary, I was you, except I didn't have a Patricia Hartley or an Eleanor Whitmore. I had to claw my way back from nothing, build my empire one acquisition at a time, prove that a 50-something woman could be more than what society said she was. She reached over and took Margaret's hand. You have a choice now. You can take your grandmother's money, sign whatever papers Richard wants, and disappear into comfortable obscurity. Or you can let me teach you what Patricia taught me, that the best revenge isn't living well. It's living strategically. Margaret looked toward the nursery where Emma was fighting for every breath. Her daughter would grow up in a world where her father had abandoned her before she was even born. But maybe, just maybe, she could grow up in a world where her mother had turned that abandonment into an empire. What would I need to do? Margaret asked. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since Richard had walked out, Margaret felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. First, you need to get well. Then, we're going to teach your narcissistic ex-husband a lesson about underestimating women. The medical contracts his companies depend on. 7 of them are with my facilities, and in about 6 weeks, they're going to belong to you. He'll fight it, Margaret warned. Richard doesn't like to lose. Good, Eleanor said, standing to leave. Neither do we. Rest now. Tomorrow, your education begins. Patricia Hartley's granddaughter is about to learn what financial independence after 50 really looks like. As Eleanor left, Margaret lay back against her pillows, her mind racing. This morning she had been an abandoned wife with nothing. Tonight, she was an heiress with a mentor and a plan. She thought about Richard, probably already back in New York, celebrating his freedom with whatever young woman had caught his attention. He thought he had played the perfect game sending her to Paris, filing for divorce while she was vulnerable, claiming abandonment to minimize his financial obligations. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed Margaret was the same woman he had married 20 years ago, eager to please, afraid of conflict, willing to accept whatever scraps he offered. That woman had died in this hospital room when he walked out. The woman who remained was someone entirely new, someone her grandmother Patricia would have recognized. Someone who understood that midlife transformation wasn't about finding yourself. It was about finally becoming yourself. 3 days later, Margaret's phone buzzed with a voicemail as she sat feeding Emma in the NICU. She almost didn't listen to it, focused on her tiny daughter's improved breathing, the way her little fingers wrapped around Margaret's pinky with surprising strength. But something, perhaps instinct, made her tap play. Richard's voice filled her earbuds. That familiar tone of condescension that she now recognized had always been there, hidden under charm and expensive gifts. Margaret, stop being dramatic. Sign the papers. You'll get your standard settlement, the Connecticut house, and $50,000 a year. That's generous considering. There was a giggle in the background, young and tinkling like champagne bubbles. Richard must not have realized his phone hadn't disconnected because the recording continued. Richard, are you coming back to bed? The woman's voice was young, probably mid-20s, with that breathy quality Richard had always found irresistible in everyone but his wife. Just dealing with my ex. Richard's voice, muffled but clear. She's being difficult about the divorce. The pregnant one, the girl asked. I thought you said she was barren. Margaret's hands clenched so tightly that Emma made a small sound of protest. Barren. He had told this girl she was barren while she was in labor with his child. She managed one at the last minute. Richard laughed. Probably thought it would save the marriage. As if I'd stay tethered to a 43-year-old woman who let herself go just because she finally squeezed out a baby. You're terrible, the girl giggled. I'm practical. Ashley, darling, can you grab my blue tie? I have the Whitmore meeting this morning. Margaret hit stop, her hands shaking. Sophie, who had been adjusting Emma's monitors, noticed immediately. Madame, are you all right? You look pale. Margaret pulled out her earbuds with trembling fingers. Sophie, can you get Mrs. Whitmore on the phone? Tell her I want to discuss her proposition. Tell her I'm ready to learn everything. Sophie smiled. Of course, Madame. I will call immediately. As Sophie left, Margaret looked down at Emma, whose eyes were finally open, unfocused but definitely her father's shape. Your daddy thinks we're worthless, she whispered. He's about to learn how expensive that mistake will be. Eleanor arrived within the hour. bringing with her a team that looked like they had stepped out of a boardroom rather than into a hospital. There was Robert James, a British CFO with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman who radiated competence and wore her medical degree like armor. And Victoria Barnes, an attorney who made Mark Stevens look like a first-year law student. "Play the voicemail," Eleanor said simply. Margaret did, watching as each face in the room shifted from professional to disgusted. Victoria was actually taking notes, her pen flying across her legal pad. When it finished, Eleanor stood. "Gentleman's agreement is off. He wants to play dirty. We'll play strategic." Robert James pulled out his laptop. "The 7 medical facilities Mr. Sullivan's companies depend on their contracts are up for renewal in 6 weeks. We'll need Margaret trained and ready by then," Dr. Chen added. "She needs to understand not just the business side, but the medical operations." "I don't know anything about running hospitals," Margaret admitted. "You know about being dismissed and overlooked," Eleanor said firmly. "That's half of healthcare right there. The other half is just paperwork and profit margins. Robert will teach you the numbers. Sarah will teach you the operations. Victoria will teach you the law. And I'll teach you the most important lesson, how to turn pain into power." Victoria looked up from her notes. "That voicemail is evidence of abandonment and cruelty. We can use it." "No," Margaret said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Not yet. Let him think I'm still the same weak woman he left. When we strike, I want it to be a complete surprise." Eleanor smiled proudly. Patricia's strategic mind lives on. "Good, now let's discuss the Phoenix Fund." "The Phoenix Fund?" Margaret asked. "That's what your grandmother called your trust. She said money was just paper unless it was used to rise from ashes." Eleanor pulled out a thick folder. "The full $212 million is available immediately, but there's more. Your grandmother also left detailed notes about Richard's business practices, things she observed when you first started dating him." Margaret took the folder, scanning her grandmother's neat handwriting. Notes about offshore accounts, questionable deal structures, patterns of behavior that suggested financial manipulation. "She investigated him," Margaret breathed. "She protected you the only way she could," Eleanor corrected, "by gathering information and waiting for you to be ready to use it." Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret's hospital room transformed into a classroom. While Emma grew stronger in the NICU, Margaret absorbed 20 years of business education in compressed time. She learned about EBITDA and acquisition strategies, about medical billing codes and insurance negotiations. She discovered she had a natural talent for seeing patterns in numbers, probably from years of managing household budgets on whatever allowance Richard deemed appropriate. "Your husband's companies are hemorrhaging money," Robert informed her one afternoon, showing her a spreadsheet. "They're completely dependent on our facilities for specialized testing. Without us, they lose 40% of their operational capacity." "What would happen if we raised our prices?" Margaret asked. "Within contract limits, we could increase by 30%. And if we terminated the contracts," Robert smiled, "they'd have to use competitors who charge 60% more and who are located much farther from their primary facilities. Transport costs alone would kill their margins." Margaret studied the numbers, seeing not just digits, but leverage. Each figure represented a choice Richard had made to prioritize profit over people. Now those choices would cost him. "There's something else," Victoria said, entering with a new stack of papers. "That young woman on the voicemail, Ashley Morrison. She's the daughter of Richard's biggest investor." Margaret looked up sharply. "He's sleeping with his investor's daughter. 23 years old, fresh out of college," Victoria confirmed. "If Morrison finds out—" "He won't," Margaret said. "Not yet. We're going to let Richard think he's winning right up until the moment he loses everything." She looked around the room at these brilliant women who had materialized in her darkest hour, summoned by a grandmother she barely remembered, and a stranger who saw herself in Margaret's story. "My millionaire ex-husband thinks I'm worthless," she said quietly. "Let's show him what worthless women can accomplish." Eleanor raised her coffee cup in a toast. "To the Phoenix Fund, to Patricia Hartley, and to women supporting women in the most devastating way possible through strategic revenge and superior business practices." As they toasted with coffee and orange juice, Emma made a small sound from her incubator, almost like agreement. Margaret went to her daughter, pressing her hand against the glass. "Your great-grandmother would have loved you," she whispered. "She would have loved what we're about to do even more." 1 week after giving birth, Margaret sat in Eleanor's office, a beautiful space overlooking the Seine. She moved carefully, her body still healing, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. The past week of intensive education had awakened something in her that 20 years of marriage had nearly killed her ambition. "The medical chain consists of 12 hospitals across Europe," Eleanor explained, spreading a map across her desk. "Paris, London, Berlin, Rome, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and 6 others. Together, they generate 800 million in annual revenue." Margaret studied the map, seeing not just locations but a network of power. "And Richard's companies depend on 7 of them. For specialized cardiac testing, oncology treatments, and rare disease protocols," Eleanor confirmed. "His medical device companies need our facilities for trials. His pharmaceutical subsidiaries need our patient data for FDA approvals. We are, quite literally, the backbone of his medical empire." "I know nothing about running hospitals," Margaret said honestly. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "You know about being dismissed and overlooked. Do you know how many women walk into emergency rooms with serious conditions only to be told they're being hysterical? How many female patients are prescribed antidepressants for physical ailments? How many mothers are ignored when they say something's wrong with their child?" Margaret thought about her own experiences, the 3 miscarriages Richard had insisted were her fault for being too stressed, the fertility doctors who spoke only to Richard during appointments, the obstetrician in New York who had dismissed her concerns about early labor just 2 weeks before Emma's premature birth. "Too many," she said quietly. "Exactly. You don't need to know how to perform surgery. You need to know how to listen. The rest is just management. And believe me, if you can manage a millionaire ex-husband's ego for 20 years, you can manage anything." Eleanor stood and walked to a painting on the wall, an original Patricia Hartley. Margaret realized with a start, her grandmother had been an artist too, before she became a hospital board member. "There's something else," Eleanor said, pressing a hidden button. The painting swung open to reveal a safe. "Your grandmother left more than money. She left intelligence." She pulled out several thick folders, placing them carefully on the desk. Patricia served on multiple boards with Richard's mentors. She took notes on everything: business practices, personal scandals, financial vulnerabilities. She knew that information was the ultimate currency. Margaret opened the first folder, finding photographs, contracts, newspaper clippings. Her grandmother's neat handwriting covered the margins with observations and connections. "She knew what Richard was before I even married him," Margaret said, a mix of anger and awe in her voice. "She knew the type," Eleanor corrected. "Narcissistic, controlling, viewing wives as accessories and children as inconveniences. But she also knew you had to learn it for yourself. All she could do was prepare for the aftermath." The second folder contained financial records, offshore accounts, shell companies, a web of financial manipulation that would make any forensic accountant salivate. "Is this legal to have?" Margaret asked. Victoria, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "Everything here was obtained through public records and legal observation. Your grandmother was very careful. She knew that someday someone would need these weapons. And now," Eleanor said, "we're going to teach you how to use them." "Robert." The CFO pulled out his laptop, turning it toward Margaret. "Your trust fund isn't just sitting in an account. Your grandmother invested it strategically. You own significant shares in 3 major medical supply companies, Richard's competitors." Margaret's eyes widened. "She bought shares in his competitors 20 years ago, when they were startups," Robert confirmed. "They're now worth 50 times what she paid. You're already a major player in the medical industry." "Margaret, you just didn't know it." Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "There's more. The research your grandmother funded, it led to 3 breakthrough treatments for pregnancy-related complications. Patents that generate 30 million annually in licensing fees. Patents that Richard's pharmaceutical company desperately wants to acquire." Margaret felt like she was drowning in information, but it was a different kind of drowning than the despair of a week ago. This was possibility threatening to overwhelm her. Why didn't she use any of this when she was alive? Margaret asked. Eleanor's expression softened. Because she was saving it for someone who would use it right. She could have destroyed your father, could have revealed Richard's true nature before your wedding. But she believed in letting people make their own choices and learn their own lessons. She just made sure the tools for recovery would be waiting. Margaret stood carefully and walked to the window. Below, Paris bustled with life. Somewhere in New York, Richard was probably in a board meeting, confident that his discarded wife would quietly accept whatever crumbs he offered. He had no idea that his 43-year-old abandoned wife was about to become his worst nightmare. "How long do I have to learn everything?" she asked. 5 weeks until the contract renewals, Eleanor said. 5 weeks to transform from Richard Sullivan's discarded wife into the CEO of MedLife International. MedLife International. The new name for the hospital chain. Your first executive decision? Margaret turned back to the room full of brilliant women who had become her board of directors, her advisors, her army. "Then we'd better get started," she said. "I have a lot to learn and a millionaire ex-husband to destroy. Sorry to professionally outmaneuver." Eleanor laughed. "Oh, my dear, never apologize for ambition. Your grandmother would tell you that the best revenge is massive success. But she'd also tell you that sometimes, just sometimes, regular revenge paired with massive success is even better." Over the next 5 weeks, Margaret absorbed information like a sponge. She learned the difference between HMO and PPO contracts, understood diagnosis codes and reimbursement rates. She discovered she had a gift for seeing inefficiencies in systems, probably from years of managing a household on Richard's deliberately restricted budget. She also learned about herself. Without Richard's constant criticism, she stood taller. Without his controlling presence, she made decisions quickly and confidently. Without his narcissistic abuse disguised as concern, she remembered who she had been before she became Mrs. Richard Sullivan. "You're a natural," Robert told her one evening as they reviewed acquisition paperwork. "Your instincts are excellent." "It's not instinct," Margaret corrected. "It's 20 years of watching Richard make these same moves. I was his unpaid intern for 2 decades. I just didn't realize I was taking notes." Emma grew stronger each day, finally able to breathe without assistance. Margaret would hold her daughter while reviewing contracts, whispering her plans for their future. "Your daddy thinks we're worthless," she would say, "but your great-grandmother knew better. She knew that women like us don't break. We rebuild, and then we buy the building." 3 weeks into her education, Margaret made her first major decision without consulting anyone. She hired 20 new female doctors for the chain's emergency departments, specifically recruiting those who had published papers on gender bias in medical treatment. "Expensive," Robert noted, but he was smiling. "Necessary," Margaret countered. "Every woman who walks into our hospitals will be heard, believed, and treated with dignity. That's not just good medicine. It's good business." Eleanor watched from the doorway, some pride evident on her face. "Patricia would be so proud. You're not just learning the business. You're revolutionizing it." As the 5th week began, Margaret stood in what would soon be her office, looking out at the London skyline. Tomorrow she would sign the papers making her the owner of MedLife International. In 1 week, Richard's contracts would come up for renewal. He still hadn't tried to contact her except through lawyers. His latest offer had increased to $75,000 a year, which his attorney called generous given the circumstances. Margaret had laughed when Victoria showed her the letter. $75,000 a year. She now made that in interest every 3 days. "Should we counter?" Victoria had asked. "No," Margaret had said. "Let him think I'm considering it. Let him think I'm the same desperate woman he left in that hospital room." Now, standing in her soon-to-be office, Margaret pulled out her phone and listened to Richard's voicemail again. Not for pain, but for motivation. "She managed one at the last minute," his recorded voice said. "Probably thought it would save the marriage." Margaret deleted the voicemail. She didn't need it anymore. Tomorrow, she would become CEO of MedLife International. Next week, she would have her first board meeting. And sometime after that, Richard Sullivan would learn that abandoning his wife during childbirth had been the worst business decision of his life. The Phoenix Fund had risen from the ashes. Now it was time to soar. 6 weeks after Paris, Margaret stood in her new office in London, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows. The transformation was complete, at least on paper. She was now CEO of MedLife International, owner of 12 hospitals, employer of 15,000 people. But more importantly, she was no longer Richard Sullivan's victim. Emma slept peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk, a sight that would have horrified Richard. He had always insisted that children had no place in professional settings. Margaret had made it policy that all MedLife facilities would have on-site childcare for employees. "Mrs. Sullivan, your 9 o'clock is here," her assistant announced. Margaret had kept the Sullivan name professionally for now. It would make the revelation that much sweeter. Dr. Sarah Chen entered with 3 other department heads. Over the past weeks, Margaret had assembled a team of brilliant women and men who understood her vision. "The staff is ready for your vision presentation this afternoon," Sarah said. "They're curious about the new ownership." Margaret nodded. "Every woman who walks through our doors will be heard, believed, and treated with dignity. Every employee will have access to childcare, mental health support, and advancement opportunities based on merit, not politics." Robert James entered without knocking, a privilege Margaret had granted her CFO. His expression was serious. "We have a situation," he said. "Richard's companies have submitted their contract renewal proposals. They're demanding a 15% discount based on volume." Margaret actually laughed. "They want a discount after what their CEO did to the new owner." "They don't know you're the owner," Robert reminded her. "The acquisition was done through shell companies. As far as they know, Eleanor sold to an anonymous investment group." "Perfect," Margaret said. "Counter with a 30% increase." Robert's eyes widened. "That's aggressive." "That's business," Margaret corrected. "They can pay it or find other facilities." "Oh, and add a clause about family leave. Any company contracting with us must provide 6 months paid parental leave." Sarah whistled low. "That'll cause waves." "Good, or it's time someone made waves in this industry." As her team dispersed to implement her decisions, Margaret turned back to the window. Somewhere in New York, Richard was probably reviewing the contract proposals, irritated by the increase but not yet alarmed. He had no idea who he was really negotiating with. Her phone buzzed. Victoria calling from New York. "Margaret, I've been monitoring the situation. Richard's having financial troubles. His investors are getting nervous about the contract renewals." "How nervous?" "Morrison Ashley's father is threatening to pull funding if the medical contracts aren't secured. He doesn't know about Richard and his daughter yet." Margaret felt a flutter of anticipation. "Keep monitoring. Don't interfere. Let Richard hang himself with his own rope." That afternoon, Margaret addressed 500 MedLife employees via video conference. She kept her face in shadow, her voice digitally altered slightly enough to maintain anonymity, but not enough to sound artificial. "Healthcare is about trust," she said. "Patients trust us with their lives, their fears, their most vulnerable moments. For too long, that trust has been betrayed by a system that prioritizes profit over people. That changes now." She outlined her vision: patient-centered care, employee support, innovation in treatment. She announced the new policies: no woman's pain would be dismissed as anxiety, no mother's concerns would be ignored, no patient would be abandoned. "Some of you may wonder why this matters to me," she continued. 6 weeks ago, I was a patient in one of our hospitals. I was abandoned during premature labor, left alone to face both childbirth and divorce. That experience taught me that healthcare isn't just about medicine, it's about humanity." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails flooded in from employees sharing their own stories, thanking her for understanding, pledging their commitment to the new vision. Eleanor called that evening. "You've inspired them. The entire chain is buzzing with excitement." "It's just the beginning," Margaret said, feeding Emma her bottle. "Next week, when Richard realizes who owns these hospitals, the real work begins. Are you ready for that confrontation?" Margaret thought about the woman she had been 6 weeks ago, scared, alone, dependent. That woman was gone, replaced by someone Richard wouldn't recognize. "I've been ready for 20 years, and she said, I just didn't know it." 3 days later, Robert burst into her office with his laptop. "You need to see this." He pulled up a business news site. The headline read, Sullivan Industries hemorrhaging value as medical contracts stall. Already, Margaret asked. It gets better. Listen to this quote from Richard. Robert read from the screen. These delays are minor negotiations with a new, obviously inexperienced ownership group. We expect resolution within days. Inexperienced, Margaret repeated and smiling. Perfect. Let him keep thinking that. Her phone rang. Eleanor. My dear, I just received a very interesting call. Richard Sullivan himself wants to meet with the new owner of MedLife. He's flying to London tomorrow. Margaret's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. Tell him the owner will meet him at the Global Healthcare Summit in Geneva. 3 days from now. Public setting. Lots of witnesses. You're going to reveal yourself at the summit. I'm going to do more than that, Margaret said. I'm going to give a keynote about our new direction, and Richard's going to be in the audience when he realizes his ex-wife owns his lifeline. She looked at Emma, who was grasping at a toy with determined concentration. Your daddy's about to learn that underestimating women is bad for business. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret worked with a speech coach to eliminate 20 years of apologetic uptalk that Richard had trained into her. She had her hair styled, bought a wardrobe that projected power rather than ornament. She practiced walking into rooms like she owned them, because now she did. The morning of the summit, she stood in her Geneva hotel room, looking at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was unrecognizable from the abandoned wife in the Paris hospital. This woman stood tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, eyes clear and confident. You are Patricia Hartley's granddaughter, she told her reflection. You are Eleanor Whitmore's protege. You are Emma's mother, and you are about to destroy the man who thought you were worthless. Sophie, who Margaret had flown in to help with Emma, appeared in the doorway. Madame, you look formidable. Thank you, Sophie. Is Emma settled? Sleeping peacefully. She will be perfect when you bring her on stage. Margaret's eyes widened. I'm not bringing her on stage. Sophie smiled mysteriously. Eleanor suggested otherwise. She said to trust the drama of the moment. An hour later, Margaret stood backstage at the Geneva Convention Center, listening to the conference organizer introduce her. In the audience, she could see Richard in the third row, checking his phone, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new CEO of MedLife International, Margaret Sullivan. She walked onto the stage, each step measured and confident. The auditorium was dim enough that Richard didn't look up immediately. But when she spoke, when her voice rang out clear and strong, his head snapped up so fast she could hear it from the stage. 6 months ago, she began, I gave birth alone in a Paris hospital while my husband of 20 years filed for divorce. The audience murmured. Richard's face had gone white. Today, she continued, I own that hospital and 11 others. The murmur became a roar. Margaret stood at the podium, letting the noise wash over her. She caught Richard's eye and held it, watching 20 years of condescension crumble into shock. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And for once, Richard Sullivan had no words. 6 months ago, she continued, her voice carrying over the gradually quieting audience, I learned that 43-year-old women are disposable, that 20-year marriages mean nothing, that narcissistic abuse can wear a designer suit and speak in boardroom language. She clicked to her first slide a photo of Saint-Antoine Hospital in Paris. This is where I was abandoned during premature labor. This is also the first hospital in what is now the MedLife International chain. Today, it has a new wing dedicated to high-risk pregnancies, staffed entirely by doctors who specialize in cases dismissed by other facilities. The audience was riveted. Richard looked like he might bolt, but his ego kept him seated. He couldn't leave without making a scene, and Richard Sullivan never made scenes, he created them for others. The medical industry, Margaret continued, has a gender problem. Women's pain is dismissed 23% more often than men's. Women wait 65% longer for pain medication in emergency rooms. Women with heart disease are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed. She clicked through slides showing statistics, each one a damning indictment of the system Richard's companies profited from. At MedLife International, we're changing that. Every facility now has protocols specifically designed to address gender bias in treatment. Every emergency room is staffed with doctors trained to recognize how diseases present differently in women. Every patient who tells us something is wrong will be believed. A hand shot up from the audience. Mrs. Sullivan, how does a former housewife suddenly have the capital and knowledge to run a medical empire? Margaret smiled. The question was planted. Victoria had made sure of it. An excellent question. It turns out that 20 years of being married to a hostile takeover specialist is quite an education. I spent 2 decades as an unpaid intern, watching my millionaire ex-husband build his empire. I learned about leveraged buyouts at dinner parties. I absorbed negotiation tactics during phone calls he thought I wasn't smart enough to understand. She paused, letting the words sink in. As for capital, I had help. My grandmother, Patricia Hartley, left me not just an inheritance, but a legacy. And Eleanor Whitmore, the brilliant woman who built this medical chain, chose to sell it to someone who understood that healthcare is about more than profit margins. This is ridiculous, Richard's voice cut through the room. He was standing now, his face red with rage. You know nothing about running hospitals. Margaret had hoped he would crack. She turned to face him directly, microphone in hand. Richard, so glad you could make it. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Sullivan, CEO of Sullivan Industries. Also the man who abandoned his wife during premature labor to commit adultery with a 23-year-old. Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones appeared, recording everything. How dare you? Richard started. How dare I what? Margaret interrupted, her voice steel. Tell the truth, run a business, succeed without you. A young woman's voice piped up from the back. Richard, who is this? Everyone turned. Ashley Morrison stood in the doorway, designer dress, confused expression, clearly having followed Richard to Geneva. I'm the CEO of MedLife International, Margaret said calmly. And you are, I'm Richard's. Ashley faltered, looking at Richard for help. But Richard was looking at someone else, a distinguished older man who had just entered behind Ashley. Morrison, Ashley's father, his biggest investor. Daddy, Ashley said, confused. What are you doing here? Morrison's face was granite. I could ask you the same question. Ashley, Margaret watched the disaster unfold with clinical detachment. This was better than anything she could have orchestrated. Richard's narcissistic need to have his young girlfriend follow him had just cost him everything. Perhaps we should return to the presentation, Margaret suggested smoothly. Mr. Sullivan, you were concerned about my qualifications? Richard sank back into his chair, defeated. Margaret clicked to her next slide. MedLife International's new contracts include mandatory 6-month parental leave for all employees of contracting companies. Any company that doesn't meet this standard will find other medical facilities for their needs. That's blackmail, Richard sputtered. That's business, Margaret corrected. The same kind of business you've conducted for 20 years, except my version doesn't abandon pregnant women or destroy families for profit. She clicked to the final slide, a photo of Emma. This is my daughter. She was born at 28 weeks, weighing 3 pounds. Her father signed away his parental rights before she was even released from the NICU. But she survived, thrived, and taught me that the strongest things often come in the smallest packages. Sophie appeared at the side of the stage, carrying Emma. Without hesitation, Margaret walked over and took her daughter, returning to the podium with Emma in her arms. Ladies and gentlemen, the future of healthcare isn't just about medicine. It's about humanity. It's about women supporting women. It's about recognizing that financial independence after 50 isn't just possible. It's powerful. It's about understanding that a midlife transformation journey can begin in the worst moment of your life and lead to this stage. The applause was thunderous. Margaret stood there, holding Emma, watching Richard shrink in his seat as Morrison's glare burned holes in his back. One more thing, Margaret said as the applause died down. Effective immediately, MedLife is terminating all contracts with companies that don't meet our new standards. Mr. Sullivan, your companies have 72 hours to comply or find new facilities. Richard stood abruptly and stormed out, Ashley hurrying after him, Morrison following with the expression that promised retribution. The audience erupted in discussion, but Margaret was done. She walked off stage to Eleanor's waiting embrace. Patricia would be so proud, Eleanor whispered. We're not done yet, Margaret whispered back. This was just the opening salvo. Victoria appeared, phone in hand. Morrison just called. He's pulling all funding from Sullivan Industries effective immediately. He also wants to discuss investing in MedLife. Margaret smiled. Tell him we'll meet next week. After Richard's companies finish crashing. You know he'll try to destroy you now, Eleanor warned. Wounded narcissists are dangerous. Let him try, Margaret said, kissing Emma's head. I've got $200 million, 12 hospitals, and the best team in the business. He's got a crumbling empire and a reputation in ruins. Robert appeared with his tablet. Stock price for Sullivan Industries just dropped 30%. Trading has been halted. Margaret felt no joy in Richard's destruction, only a sense of justice. He had abandoned her at her most vulnerable. Now she was returning the favor, but with significantly better style. What's next? Sarah Chen asked, joining their group. Now we build, Margaret said. We create the healthcare system women deserve. We prove that companies can be profitable and compassionate. We show the world that women supporting women isn't just a hashtag, it's a revolution. She looked down at Emma, who was gazing up at her with those eyes so like her father's, but holding none of his cruelty. And we ensure that no woman is ever abandoned in a hospital room again. 1 year after Paris, Margaret sat in a New York courtroom, the same courthouse where Richard had once triumphantly concluded hostile takeovers. Now, he sat across from her, diminished, his empire in ruins, fighting over scraps in their divorce proceedings. Judge Martha Coleman presiding, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and particular intolerance for men who abandon pregnant wives. Victoria had been strategic in ensuring they drew her for the case. We're here for the Sullivan divorce proceedings, Judge Coleman announced, reviewing the papers. Mr. Sullivan, I see you're contesting the original settlement you proposed. Richard's new attorney, he'd gone through 3 since Morrison pulled funding, stood nervously. Your Honor, my client's circumstances have changed dramatically. Mrs. Sullivan's inheritance and business acquisitions should be considered marital assets. Margaret watched Richard's face, seeing the desperation he was trying to hide. Sullivan Industries had declared bankruptcy 3 months ago. His assets were frozen. The apartment he'd shared with Ashley was in foreclosure. Ashley herself had disappeared back to Switzerland after her father cut her off. Victoria stood, immaculate as always. Your Honor, we have several points to address. First, Mr. Sullivan abandoned his wife during premature labor to commit adultery. Allegedly, Richard's attorney interjected. Victoria smiled. We have security footage from the Paris hospital. She handed a USB drive to the bailiff. Additionally, we have a voicemail Mr. Sullivan left his wife while with his mistress. The courtroom watched as the security footage played Richard walking out of the hospital room while Margaret was clearly in distress. Then the voicemail, Richard's dismissive tone, Ashley's giggle, the damning words about Margaret being barren. Judge Coleman's expression grew increasingly disgusted. Mr. Sullivan, is this your voice? Richard's jaw clenched. Yes, but, and is this you leaving your wife in premature labor? I had a business meeting. That's a yes, the judge noted. Continue, Ms. Barnes. Victoria pulled out more documents. The prenuptial agreement, Mr. Sullivan insisted upon specifically states that inheritance received during the marriage remains separate property. Mrs. Sullivan's grandmother's trust was released after the separation, making it entirely hers. But she used that money to destroy my business, Richard burst out. Margaret finally spoke. I used that money to buy hospitals. Richard, what happened to your business was a result of your own choices. Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Sullivan, would you care to elaborate? Margaret stood, Emma on her hip. She'd brought her daughter deliberately, knowing the visual impact. Your Honor, I purchased a medical chain that Mr. Sullivan's companies happened to contract with. I required all contracting companies to provide parental leave and meet certain ethical standards. His companies failed to meet those standards. The free market responded accordingly. You targeted me, Richard accused. The way you targeted me when you sent me alone to Paris? Margaret responded calmly. When you changed our account passwords while I was in labor, when you had divorce papers served while I was recovering from an emergency C-section, the judge held up her hand. I've heard enough. Mr. Sullivan, You abandoned your wife during a medical emergency. You attempted to financially strand her in a foreign country. You committed adultery. And now you want access to money she inherited after you left her. She shuffled papers with obvious disgust. Here's my ruling. The original settlement stands. Mrs. Sullivan gets the Connecticut house and $50,000 annually. Though given Mr. Sullivan's current financial state, that alimony is suspended until he's employed. Mrs. Sullivan's inheritance and business assets are entirely hers. Furthermore, she paused, looking directly at Richard. Mr. Sullivan, you signed away parental rights to avoid child support. That decision is final. You have no claim to Emma Sullivan, and she has no financial obligation to you. Oh, this is ridiculous. Richard stood, his facade finally cracking completely. I made her who she is. Margaret stood too, matching his energy but with calm control. No, Richard, you made me who I was. I made me who I am. You were nothing, he shouted. A failed artist playing housewife. Everything you have is because of what you learned from me. The courtroom was silent. Even his attorney looked embarrassed. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile. You're right. I did learn from you. I learned how to recognize a hostile takeover. I learned how to exploit weakness. I learned how to read contracts and find loopholes. 20 years of watching you destroy companies taught me exactly how to destroy yours. She adjusted Emma on her hip, her daughter playing with her pearl necklace, Patricia Hartley's pearls. But here's what you never learned. Richard, business isn't just about winning. It's about building something that matters. You spent 20 years destroying. I've spent 1 year creating. You abandoned your family for a stock price. I built an empire on the principle that no family should be abandoned. Judge Coleman gavelled. We're done here. Divorce granted. Mrs. Sullivan, you're free to resume your maiden name if you choose. I'll keep Sullivan, Margaret said, looking at Richard. I've earned it. As they left the courthouse, Richard caught up to them on the steps. Margaret, wait. She turned, Victoria moving protectively closer. Richard looked broken. Finally, yes, completely. I need your help. No one else will see me. My reputation is ruined. I have nothing. Margaret studied the man she'd once loved, then feared, then fought. Now she felt something unexpected pity. You have a daughter who deserves to know her father, even a flawed one, she said quietly. I signed away legal rights. Yes, but Emma will grow up knowing her father abandoned her, unless you want to change that story. Richard's eyes filled with tears, genuine tears, maybe the first she'd ever seen from him. None of us deserve grace. Richard, that's what makes it grace. Margaret shifted Emma to her other hip. I'm not offering you a job or money or restoration, but if you want to know your daughter, if you're willing to do the work to become someone worthy of her, we can discuss supervised visits. Richard nodded, unable to speak. Call Victoria when you're ready. And Richard, Margaret waited until he met her eyes. Therapy, real therapy, not the performance you did during our marriage counseling. Deal with your narcissistic behaviors. Learn to actually care about someone besides yourself. Emma deserves a father, but only if he's healthy enough not to hurt her. As their car pulled away, Victoria shook her head. That was more generous than he deserved. It wasn't for him, Margaret said, kissing Emma's head. It's for her. Every child deserves the chance to know both parents, even if one of them has to earn that privilege. She looked back at the courthouse where Richard still stood, looking lost. Besides, she added, the best revenge isn't destroying someone completely. It's succeeding so thoroughly that you can afford to be gracious. My grandmother taught me that, in her own way. Her phone buzzed. Eleanor calling. Turn on the news, Eleanor said without preamble. Margaret had the driver turn on the radio. MedLife International announced today that it's expanding to the United States with the acquisition of 3 major hospital chains. CEO Margaret Sullivan, who took over the European chain just 1 year ago, has transformed it into the fastest-growing healthcare company in the world. The acquisition makes MedLife the 3rd largest medical provider globally. Margaret smiled. Did you know about this? I may have facilitated some introductions, Eleanor said coyly. Your grandmother had contacts everywhere. They've been waiting to see what Patricia Hartley's granddaughter would do with her inheritance. And, and they're impressed. The offer came from them, not us. They want to be part of what you're building. Margaret looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her arms. 1 year ago, she'd been abandoned, alone, afraid. Now she was building a healthcare revolution. You know what this means? Eleanor continued. You'll be running hospitals in the same cities where Richard once did business, where he once had power. The universe has a sense of humor, Margaret agreed, but she wasn't thinking about Richard anymore. She was thinking about the thousands of women who would walk into midlife hospitals, women in labor, women in pain, women afraid and alone, and find not abandonment but support, not dismissal but validation. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had somehow seen this future and planned for it. About Eleanor, who had recognized a phoenix ready to rise. About Sophie, Sarah, Robert, Victoria, the team that had believed in her before she believed in herself. Mostly, she was thinking about Emma, who would grow up in a world where her mother had proven that 43-year-old women weren't disposable, that 20-year marriages ending could be beginnings, that millionaire ex-husbands who thought their wives were worthless could be wrong, that women supporting women wasn't just a phrase, it was a power that could change the world. 2 years after that night in Paris, Margaret stood in the same hospital room where her life had shattered and reformed. The space had been renovated, part of MedLife's new birthing center, but she could still map every memory onto these walls. The corner where Richard had stood checking his phone, the spot where she'd gripped the bed rails, the door he'd walked through, never looking back. Emma toddled beside her, nearly 2 now, dark curls bouncing as she explored the room with fearless curiosity. "Mama up!" Emma demanded, raising her arms. Margaret lifted her daughter, settling her on her hip with practiced ease. Through the window, Paris spread before them, afternoon sun turning the Seine to gold. "This is where you were born, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, "where everything changed." "Madame Sullivan." Sophie's voice rang out from the doorway. The young nurse who had held Margaret's hand through labor was now head of maternity services, recruited personally by Margaret to transform the birthing experience at Saint-Antoine. "Sophie," Margaret embraced her warmly. "How is our new patient?" "Scared," Sophie said quietly. "Her husband just left. Said he couldn't handle the stress of a premature birth." Margaret's jaw tightened. Some things never changed, but now she could do something about it. "What's her name?" or Claire Dubois. 28 weeks pregnant. Early labor. Husband filed for divorce yesterday. Margaret handed Emma to Sophie. "Watch her for a moment." She walked down the hall to room 247, knocking gently before entering. The woman in the bed looked up with red-rimmed eyes. So young, so frightened, so familiar. "Mrs. Dubois, I'm Margaret Sullivan. I own this hospital." Claire's eyes widened. "The CEO, why are you?" "Because 2 years ago, I was you." Margaret pulled a chair close to the bed. 28 weeks pregnant, early labor, husband walking out. "Only I didn't have what you're going to have." "What's that?" Claire whispered. "Support, resources, options." Margaret took the young woman's hand. "Your medical care is covered completely. We have a fund for situations exactly like this. You'll have a private room, the best doctors, and when you're ready, our legal team will ensure you get everything you're entitled to in the divorce." Claire started crying. "Why would you do this?" "Because women supporting women isn't just a corporate slogan here. It's what we do." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone here." She stayed with Claire until the young woman was calm, then returned to find Eleanor in her office. Emma playing with blocks on the floor while Sophie and Eleanor discussed staffing reports. "How many is that now?" Eleanor asked. 15 women this month across all facilities," Margaret replied. 15 women abandoned during pregnancy or childbirth, and all 15 receiving full support from the Patricia Hartley Foundation. Margaret nodded. The foundation, funded by her inheritance returns, provided everything from medical care to legal services to housing assistance for women abandoned during their most vulnerable moments. Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. "Speaking of your grandmother's legacy, you'll want to see this." She handed Margaret the phone. A news alert. Richard Sullivan, named director of Morrison Foundation's New Men's Mental Health Initiative. Margaret read further. Richard had spent the past year in intensive therapy, publicly discussing his journey to address narcissistic personality disorder. Morrison, of all people, had funded his transformation, saying that men who destroyed their families needed treatment, not just punishment. "He's doing the work," Eleanor observed. "Finally," Margaret agreed. She'd allowed supervised visits with Emma 6 months ago. Richard was awkward, uncertain, but trying. Emma called him Richard instead of Daddy, which seemed appropriate. Victoria entered without knocking another person who'd earned that privilege. "We have a situation. Wall Street Journal wants to do a profile. From abandoned wife to medical mogul, the Margaret Sullivan story." Margaret considered. She'd avoided most media, preferring to let the work speak for itself. "But tell them yes. But I want to bring someone with me." "Who won Claire Dubois? Let her tell her story alongside mine. Show that this isn't just history, it's happening every day." Robert appeared in the doorway, grinning. "Speaking of media attention, we just got word. Fortune 500. MedLife made the list." The room erupted in celebration. Margaret picked up Emma, spinning her around as her daughter giggled. Fortune 500. From abandoned wife to running one of the most successful companies in America in 2 years. Her phone rang. "Richard." "I'll take this outside," she said, stepping onto the terrace. "Margaret." Richard's voice was different now. Therapy had stripped away the arrogance, leaving something raw but more honest. "I saw the news, Fortune 500, congratulations." "Thank you. I wanted to tell you, in therapy today, we talked about making amends. Real amends, not the performative kind." Margaret waited. "I was wrong. About everything. You weren't worthless. You were priceless. And I was too narcissistic to see it. Emma isn't a mistake or a burden. She's extraordinary. The divorce wasn't your failure. It was mine." "Richard, please let me finish. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did is unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. The cruelty, the calculation, the narcissistic abuse disguised as love. And I'm sorry. Genuinely, truly sorry." Margaret looked through the window at Emma, who was now building an impressively tall tower with blocks. "I appreciate that, Richard, and I hope you continue the work. For Emma's sake, if nothing else." "I will. I promise. And Margaret, what you've built, it's remarkable. You've helped thousands of women. You've changed an entire industry. You did all that despite me, but maybe also because of me. Because surviving me made you strong enough to do this." Margaret thought about it. "No, Richard. Surviving you didn't make me strong. It revealed strength that was always there. Strength my grandmother saw. Strength Eleanor recognized. Strength that Emma will inherit. You didn't make me who I am. You just got out of the way long enough for me to become myself." After ending the call, Margaret returned to her office to find her team planning the Fortune 500 celebration. "Champagne," Eleanor offered. "Orange juice," Margaret countered. "Some of our employees are pregnant." Everyone laughed. Classic Margaret, always thinking of others. As the sun set over Paris, Margaret stood at the window with Emma in her arms, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and built. Eleanor, her mentor and friend. Sophie, who'd held her hand through the worst night of her life. Victoria, Robert, Sarah, the team that had helped her build an empire from ashes. "You know what I realize," Margaret said to the room. "Everyone talks about the phoenix rising from the ashes, but no one talks about what the phoenix does after it rises." "What does it do?" Sophie asked. Margaret smiled, looking at each face in turn. "It builds a nest. It creates a home for other birds who've been burned. It teaches them to fly. And eventually, it creates a whole flock of phoenixes, all risen, all powerful, all supporting each other." Emma pointed at a bird flying past the window and said her new favorite word, "Fly." "That's right, baby," Margaret whispered. "We fly." Eleanor raised her juice glass. "To Patricia Hartley, who saw the future and planned for it. To abandoned wives who became CEOs. To narcissistic ex-husbands who accidentally created their own competition. to midlife transformations that begin in hospital rooms, and to women supporting women, not just in word but in deed, not just in gesture but in empire building, revolutionary, world-changing action. They toasted as the Eiffel Tower began its evening sparkle, and Margaret thought about the journey. 2 years ago, she'd been left with nothing but pain and $10,000. Now she ran a healthcare empire worth billions. 2 years ago, she'd been told she was worthless. Now she employed thousands and had transformed healthcare for millions. But the real transformation wasn't in the money or the power. It was in the knowledge that she'd always been valuable, had always been capable, had always been enough. Richard leaving hadn't broken her. It had freed her. 5 years had passed since that night in Paris. Margaret stood before 3,000 healthcare executives at the Global Medical Innovation Summit in New York, the same city where Richard had once ruled his empire. But this wasn't about Richard anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every word. 5 years ago, MedLife International was 12 hospitals in Europe. Today, we're the largest healthcare network in the world, operating in 32 countries. But our measure of success isn't in numbers. It's in lives changed. The screen behind her showed statistics. Maternal mortality down 40% in MedLife facilities. Gender bias in diagnosis reduced by 60%. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high across the industry. We did this by following one simple principle: believing women, believing patients, believing that healthcare is a human right, not a luxury. In the front row sat her board of directors. Eleanor, now chairman emeritus, silver hair gleaming under the lights. Victoria, chief legal officer, who'd turned down Supreme Court clerkships to stay with MedLife. Robert, whose financial wizardry had made them the most profitable healthcare company while maintaining the lowest patient costs. Sarah Chen, chief medical officer, who'd revolutionized their treatment protocols. And in the third row, surprisingly, sat Richard. Not the Richard of 5 years ago. That man was gone. This Richard was grayed, humbled, taking notes as she spoke. He ran a foundation now, teaching reformed narcissistic executives how to recognize and address their toxic behaviors. He saw Emma every other weekend, had learned to braid her hair, attended her ballet recitals, and never once complained about the glitter that inevitably covered his designer suits afterward.